Will Potter, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Greg.
I'm delighted that you're here. Will, I'm wondering if we can just kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, my name's Will Potter. I'm an investigative journalist and author. I'm also a TED Senior Fellow. Most of my work has been focused on political repression and how protesters and social movements have been labeled as terrorists post September 11th. And that really started with me back around that era. I had some experiences with the FBI shortly after 9/11, where they visited me at home when I was working at the Chicago Tribune, threatened to put me on a domestic terrorist list unless I became an informant and helped spy on protest groups. And that really became the start of an obsession. And I think this new book, Little Red Barns, is honestly a continuation of that obsession of trying to understand these mechanisms of power and how voices of protest and dissent end up getting silenced.
Excellent. Well, as you just mentioned, you do have a brand new book coming out. What's the release date again on Little Red Barns?
June 24th is coming
Okay,
out.
perfect. Great. So very timely. Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Table will be from City Lights Books. I've been to the City Lights bookstore in San Francisco too, which is actually kind of a cool little connection when I saw they were putting out your stuff. I liked that a lot. Um, okay, so you have another book as well. Green is the New Red. And I'm curious about the period after Green is the New Red, building to this book about factory farms and animal liberation. Tell me a little bit about that interim period after the first book, leading to the second book.
Yeah, it's a great question. Green is the New Red was really about how groups that were being labeled as radicals for things like civil disobedience, protest, property destruction, underground groups like the Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front were all being labeled as terrorists by the government, or in fact, as the number one domestic terrorism threat, eco-terrorism.
Hmm.
Um, and as soon as that book came out, though, in 2011, I started to see a rapid shift. And by traveling internationally, I was doing speaking events, I was moving all over the world for book tours and meeting with activists. And I started seeing that playbook that I had described in the United States was already spreading to countries all over the world. And it was also spreading towards the mainstream. And that's really where this book picks up with attempts to label people who didn't do anything like sabotage or breaking windows or arson, but were taking photographs of factory farm conditions, animal abuse, environmental conditions, and even they were being labeled as terrorists and being targeted with new laws called ag-gag laws. Ag is for agriculture and gag is to silence. So these new state laws were being passed and also spreading around the world, making even that illegal. So this new project, Little Red Barns, it's hiding the truth from farm to fable, and that latter part is important because I really end up going into the storytelling and the kind of mythology of agriculture that's used to keep all this stuff in the dark and how these tactics went from, the so-called radicals to the most mainstream groups working today.
Excellent. Well, you know what's really funny? I actually realized when you said that just now that I misspoke when I said
Oh,
from
no
farm to
problem.
table. So thank you for the correction because I looked at my notes and I was like, oh, wait, it is Fable because it's right here on my screen in front of me and I just
That's what.
misread it. So thank you for the correction. Hiding the truth from farm to fable for the listeners out there. Wonderful. So, Will, tell me a little bit about the overall goal of this new book, what you're trying to accomplish for readers.
To be honest, the driving goal for me in this project has been to get this book out of me. It has been such a, like I said, an obsession. It's really been dominating my thinking of trying to understand how these tactics are changing. So my primary motivation, I feel like most good projects as a writer, has to be a little bit selfish of thinking through these issues. And what I hope it does for readers is pull together a lot of different themes and trends we're seeing in the world right now, from factory farming, food issues to the rise of fascism globally and help make sense of it a little bit to understand the mythology behind these trends and some of the threats that link them together.
Yeah. This feels like a career spanning work for you. I'm reading it and it feels like I'm reading examples and stories from when you were a tiny little guy, you know? So this
Yeah.
is something that takes place across your entire life. And in the book, I love how you talk about like growing up in Texas. Um, I'd love to know a little bit about your childhood and how your childhood inspires the storytelling within the book because, farming is the first thing that so many of us are taught as children in this culture. Um, and so just tell me a little bit about how your own childhood plays into your framing for this book.
And I do talk personally more than I have in any other project in this book. There is a lot of memoir. And the reason I chose to do that is because even though I've been immersed in these issues for decades now, I grew up born and raised in Texas, in Fort Worth, outside of Fort Worth, in what at the time was a pretty small town, and grew up with family members having farm animals and staying on their land and riding horses and taking care of the hogs and that kind of thing. And I really wanted to include that also to emphasize that these narratives capture all of us from a really young age. I think sometimes in these issues, we like to think that this awareness of the problems of the world has always been there, but like it just hasn't. And for me, frankly, it took quite a long time. And the reason I started becoming aware of how animals were treated in factory farms and these other issues is really through punk rock. And that's kind of why the book opens in that way of these were spaces that exposed me to issues I'd never thought of before and really set me on this path for many years after that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the way the book kicks off. It's so much about music in the very beginning of the book, and that was my own exposure to animal rights movements in general. Obviously, Propaganda's Less Talk, More Rock, animal friendly, right on the cover of the album from 1996 is one of my foremost favorite albums, and you quote one of their songs in the opening chapter. Why'd you kick off the book with Propaganda? Because obviously, I love that band so much, but I'm just curious about your story there too.
Yeah, I had a similar story. I mean, they were really influential in shaping my thinking on a lot of issues from that record, honestly, on about like 1996 or so. And there are a lot of choices. I wanted to open the book with a lyric or a liner note from a punk or hardcore band to really situate it in that moment. And I went with that because they had such a big influence on me. And I think they're one of these bands that has been so consistent over the years that I
Mhm.
admire and respect a lot. That this hasn't been a passing trend. They've consistently talked about animals and food and farming and our diets alongside many other social justice issues. And that's really how I view these issues as well. This isn't a single issue. They're all connected.
Yeah, well, and then you have stuff like Gorilla Biscuits has like the song like Cats and Dogs, and then you have bands like Vegan Reich, and you have bands like Earth Crisis, obviously with the Firestorm album. And I was just listening to a great interview with Carl Buechner from Earth Crisis the other day on another podcast called Hard Lore, and the stories of tying in animal rights into punk and hardcore is so important. So I wanted to give you the chance if you had any other shout outs within music, and how important that scene was for you for framing your own animal rights viewpoints in the world.
Really going back to Green is the New Red, when I was talking about radical activism, I wrote in that book that to understand these movements, you have to understand punk and hardcore. They're inseparable. And that came to the forefront even more in this project. Um, you know, Vegetarianism and veganism has a long history in punk, going back to a lot of the British bands in the 70s and 80s, from Crass and Subhumans and Flux of Pink Indians. When it came over to the US, American hardcore kind of revitalized things, like you said, with bands like Gorilla Biscuits and Youth Today, Minor Threat to an extent. And where I saw all of that emerging, what happened in the 90s was this kind of new movement that really centered it, that it wasn't just part of a host of other issues, but it was like a driving force. And I think that's really important to understand these movements and kind of the militancy and the passion and dedication that came out of it. And also, an important thing to understand about punk is that the DIY mentality, the idea that like if you want to tour the world and put out a record, you just go do it yourself. And I see that so much in the animal protection movement, environmental movements in particular. A lot of the undercover investigations and documentation I detail throughout the book really had that same spirit. This was a very low budget affair to begin with. And I guess to answer your question, there are a lot of other folks I could shout out. I mean, one of them would be Rise Against, who started using some of this footage in um, their music videos and trailers and things like that, and have also been really consistent in their advocacy. And when I started seeing things like that happen, taking the new footage with those types of platforms, it just exposed millions of people, quite
Yeah.
literally, to these issues.
Yeah, their "Eco Terrorist and Me" video, I think, is what really jumps out in my major attention to what they've done. Your chapter one, first chapter in the book, is such a great overview of like 1990s through 2010s animal rights activist media. You mention the Earthlings film very passionately. You talk about the importance of Patty Mark and Eddie Lama. Curious just a little bit more about any like the major important figures within this chapter that you really enjoyed mentioning.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to understand at this time is that the technology, social media, video technology, everything was changing in the media landscape. And it really, as a writer, I hate this analogy of the perfect storm, but man, it really was. It's these
Yeah.
conditions that were combining alongside a really emboldened and quickly maturing and growing animal rights movement that really made for these conditions to, as I describe in the book, lead a revolution in nonviolent advocacy and activism, and frankly, in journalism. These were people that didn't really have experience in these types of undercover documentation, but went out and taught themselves and did it anyway. And so, some of the people that were really, in my mind, out front at that time were also people like me and Park. She was working with Compassion over Killing, which later turned into Animal Outlook. These are groups that were on the front lines with all kinds of innovative forms of civil disobedience, locking them their necks to seemingly everything at the time. And then they pivoted and they started looking at, well, how do we reach people with video? How do we try to be a little bit less confrontational or adversarial in our approach, and instead try to show what is happening and bring people along. And that's really where these changes took place.
Awesome. So let's chat a little bit about your own eye-opening experiences. What was the most eye-opening first moment that changed your view personally with regards to animal agriculture? What's like your inciting incident?
That's kind of tough. I think there are a couple of them. If I'm going to one of the earliest or true turning points, I remember I was working at the radio station in Austin. I was the news manager at KVRX. I was walking to the station, and a friend of mine, um, this was 97, 98, I guess, um, just turned to me, and she was already vegan and I was not at the time. I wasn't really aware of any of this. And she was just straight up like, well, you're passionate about all these issues. You're going to these different protests. You're working on like the sanctions against Iraq and all these different campaigns. Maybe you should look into this. And she gave me a book called Diet for a New America by John Robbins. And that really was the turning point for me. I went vegetarian right away and vegan pretty soon after that. Um, Another turning point in the book I really talk about and open the book with is seeing that first footage, which at the time in the late 90s was kind of hard to come by. I mean, we're on VHS tapes, we're not on YouTube and things like that. But really, the combination of those two things, really putting the facts and substance behind it, and then the visceral experience of seeing it, really changed me as a person and really changed my career trajectory as well.
You do a really nice overview as well, talking about the shift of North American society away from agrarian living, and how that impacted the raising and slaughter of animals in general. Like, what do you think that people really need to know about the shift in what our society has undergone and how it's made us treat animals differently?
I think the most important thing is that everything about how we live today feels so normal and inevitable And if we need food, we go to the grocery store and it's all wrapped up nice and clean and cellophane. And, if we need whatever, we go to the other store. This consumer capitalism, as we understand it now, is still a relatively modern invention. And if you look back even at the 1940s and 50s, um, the way that Americans lived in particular was radically different. Most people were either creating, raising their own food, their own products that they needed, or that they were connected to a farm in some way. And what I saw in the government research over these decades is there's just a seismic shift in how we live and how we understand food and agriculture, that we became removed from it. We don't see what's happening anymore. It's not in our communities, it's in someone else's community. It's in places that we drive past, and maybe we've all had that experience of you see the truck of animals on the road and maybe like some feathers out the back, right? And that's kind of it. And I think that is at the heart of where this fracture started to take place, that the industry exploited. And they wanted to keep us removed and detached from these industrial changes in factory farming that were taking place.
Yeah, and something else that's really interesting for me to ponder is that I've done a little bit of research on this topic too, and the life stories of the people who work in the slaughterhouse facilities. We've also outsourced extremely violent and dangerous work to people that immigrate from other places. And so not only are we not involved personally with the raising of the animals, but we are also like largely not involved with the with doing the actual jobs that pay the money that bring the food to us as well too.
I think that's a really critical point that gets left out of this discussion. I think that's the dynamic that allows this disconnect and separation to exist. Because you're right, the people that work on factory farms are overwhelmingly immigrant, overwhelmingly not native English speakers. That has repercussions beyond just the kind of power and structural imbalances in this country, right? Of fundamental fairness and access to resources. Because when the industry starts talking about making illegal to take photographs on a farm, the people that are most likely to see improper behavior or illegal behavior are also the people kind of least likely to have access to lawyers and resources and things to help them navigate that. And that power dynamic is really important to understand how industrial agriculture is working today, especially now in the US as we're seeing this like anti-immigrant hysteria and deportations and crackdowns. This is an already disenfranchised population that are, as you said, being tasked with the work that the rest of the white affluent country doesn't want to do or isn't able to do.
Yeah. So one of the biggest fables that you talk about is the family farm, right? But it's not really like there's a way that it's classified to kind of fool us into thinking that it's a family farm, but these major conglomerates that are kind of overseeing this network of farms that were family farms like long ago, but have changed. And there's this saying that I want you to chat a little bit about: get big or get out. Tell me a little bit about this fable and how that saying matters.
Yeah, to the first point, there's this rhetoric from the industry that, well, we're all family farmers. You're attacking the family farm. We're the heartland of America. And the truth is that the way family farms are defined is just that a member of the family has controlling interests in the farm. It has nothing to do with the farm size, right? So a factory farm, a farm with hundreds of thousands of birds or thousands of head of cattle, or um, as big and as polluting as you can imagine, if the family member has some leadership in the operation of the farm, it is a family farm. And I think that's deliberately misleading and deceptive. And it really goes back to masking these changes that have happened in the industry. That phrase, get big or big out, get out, is taken on kind of a mythical tone in the history of agriculture. It was described to farmers like in the 40s and 50s that this is the future. The only way they're going to survive is to industrialize, consolidate, get bigger, or just disappear. And that's become kind of the marching orders of the industry and of government policy for decades now. It's been more consolidation, more concentration. And so the actual family farmers, smaller farms that are trying to do things at scale sustainably, are being screwed not just by uh, government, but by industry itself as kind of their biggest adversary, that they have to fight back against this industry trying to push them out of existence.
Yeah, and I would imagine that the ongoing tariff developments in the United States are going to make the lives of farmers even harder because so many international farming agriculture contracts with the United States are being canceled left and right. So I'd imagine that the current events are shifting on the ground every single day at the moment. I would imagine. Are you following that at all?
I'm doing, like most of us, I think I'm doing the best I can to keep up with it. The ramifications of this are just sweeping and truly unprecedented. Yeah, farmers are going to have a lot to lose in this in a lot of different ways, both of just being able to survive domestically as a domestic producer, but also a big shift in animal agriculture over these last years has been more and more um, animals raised in the US are being shipped internationally to other countries. So, regardless of how you feel about kind of the animal treatment or the environmental issues, fundamentally, what we're seeing the Trump administration do right now is meant to wreak havoc and to destabilize these systems. And that's exactly what it's doing. The intention is to destabilize them so that we become more wedded to the government, more dependent on the government, more kind of acquiescent in begging the government for support after they're chopping us off at the knees. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's an ongoing and developing story, and I imagine that you'll be following that closely in the coming years. Let's chat a little bit about, you ask the reader to bear witness, right? Tell me a little bit more about this because I find that phrase every single time I read it, bearing witness. I find it to be so important for so many topics, whether it's, the ongoing situation in Gaza and the deaths of, people in Gaza, whether it is, regarding civil wars around the world, whether it's regarding the industrial treatment and slaughter of millions and millions of animals, whether it's the conditions, the living and working conditions for vulnerable populations of people. The phrase "bearing witness" is so important. And just tell me a little bit about what this means within the context of your book.
Yeah, and it's something that's really guided my entire life as a journalist. And I realized in the course of writing this book that I'd never really examined it and tried to get to the root of what it means. And it's a term that comes from really two communities, from kind of the Christian church most often, and also journalists, which is kind of two incongruous, conflicting environments. But the heart of both of it is this idea of we have a moral and spiritual imperative of not turning away from darkness and injustice. And what that often is reduced to, I think, in popular culture is that we just have to look. Like we have to keep scrolling through the genocide footage on our phone, or we have to look at the horrible animal abuse footage. And what I realized in this book is that bearing witness means more than that. It's to look and to refuse to turn away, but it's also to testify, meaning to speak up about it. That's what the term has always been through multiple faiths over thousands of years. It's been to witness and then to testify. And I think that's more important now than ever. If there's really one message I hope people take away from this book, it's that we all have this capacity. It's not just for journalists. It's not just for, to beat people over the head with your religious scripture. It's a way of moving through dark times and dangerous times in the world right now that is, I think, quite empowering and also generates empathy. The more we can connect with other people by truly seeing them, it also changes us as well.
Bearing Witness 2.0, as the chapter says, right? That I love
Absolutely.
that. It's not just looking, it's also calling stuff out and being involved and being able to communicate on these issues in your own way, in whatever capacity you're able. Um, so there's so much going on in the world right now, as we just briefly chatted about.
A little
What
bit, yeah.
what are your strategies for the next like year with regards to paying attention to the issues that you report on in your own work? Tell me a little bit about how you are recalibrating as a journalist in order to move forward into these very uncertain coming months in the fields that you report on.
That's a really tough question, man. I have to say, like, there is a lot of recalibrating going on, in a few different ways. One thing I talk about a little bit in the book are just this is an increasingly dangerous environment for investigative journalists and for people speaking truth to power. So there's that set of considerations about risk and understanding risk and making smart decisions. There's also kind of an existential shift that I'm and many other journalists and academics and writers are feeling because it feels like we've entered this era where facts don't matter, the truth doesn't matter. All that matters is the spectacle, the myth, the kind of fraudulent narratives of these snake oil salesmen that shockingly so many people are going along with. And it's really made me question, like, well, where do I go with that? I feel like journalism is becoming extinct, especially investigative journalism. Um, and so I'm struggling with it. I talk about this quite a bit in the book. And despite all of these struggles, I still have come back to bearing witness. I don't know if come back to journalism necessarily. That's something I'm still struggling with of like, what is my role? If I really want to bear witness, is it through news reporting? Is it through investigations and making sure all of my sources and footnotes and everything are precise and dialed in? Or is it trying to meet people where they are and maybe speak in a different way? And I guess this book reflects that right now. I'm speaking in a different way than I have traditionally as a journalist, and I think it's because that's changing in me.
Yeah. Well, the book does, and I'm there's so much in this book. This book is fantastic. I love it, by the way. But I'm
Thank you.
obviously I want people to read it themselves. And there's so much that we can't even get into about censorship laws, about government repression, about global fascism. I mean, there is so much in here that we can't even get to that I think that the readers should really, examine for themselves. So I'm glad that we were just able to talk a little bit about each of these topics. What are some wellness strategies you have? Because for me, I feel like every day is an exercise in not losing my own grip on reality. Um, do
Absolutely.
is what I am seeing what other people are seeing? How do other people not experience what I am seeing in ways that make them go, "Oh my God, I can't believe that I was wrong about XYZ." How are you like coping with like wellness strategies in your own life doing such emotionally demanding work?
Yeah, and that's really a theme throughout Little Red Barns as well. It's like, what does it mean to see, and how do we, as the people that are they're seeing these horrible things happen in the world, and that we feel something about it, how do we also feel seen and feel like we're not, like you said, just coming unglued? Which, frankly, I feel like quite a bit of the time these days. Um, I'm not one, I've been really open with my struggles with PTSD and depression really related to this work. I think my coping strategies fundamentally, in addition to all the kind of self-care things that you can find on the internet, meditation and cold plunges and diet and weightlifting and things like that, is trying to gravitate towards the people that are trying to make it better. I mean, I don't really know any other way to say it. Like in these last couple of years in particular, I've been trying to reconnect with people I've lost touch with, that have been a little too myopic in my focus on work and not maintaining some friendships and professional relationships. And really just trying to swim to those people and remember that like we're out in this sea change together. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do. I think there's a real pressure that comes from seeing these horrible things that are happening and feeling like, well, we just have to go do. We have to fix this. We have to figure out the right thing to do. And this feeling like we're never enough is something I struggle with a lot. And I think one of the best ways to counteract that is to kind of slow it down a little bit, focus on the people in our lives that are reminding us we are on the right track. And once you have those people, I think action flows out of that naturally. So let this be I guess, a permission or a reminder to folks listening to this. If you need it and you're trying to do the work, it's okay to pull back as much as you need, because we need people that are fighting this over lifetimes, not over a period of months or years. This is going to be a lifetime fight.
Well, last question. If people want to reduce their own animal product consumption, what are a couple of resources that you would immediately direct them to for some easy, not easy because it's not easy to change your lifestyle, but some resources that they can dig into that are digestible and accessible for people that have never explored those dietary paths?
Yeah, and in particular, if folks are listening to this, and a lot of the talking points of the industry have been like, "Oh, this is so expensive. It's not healthy. It's processed." If you want to cut through a lot of that rhetoric, beyond reading Little Red Barns, there's a couple resources come to mind. One is called Plant Based on a Budget, which is a project that is just lots of free, easy to make plant-based meals that are also cheap and few ingredients and really simple. And I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, you don't need to go out and buy all the fancy new vegan products and all the supplements and all the things that like were kind of fed to us through these influencer culture. Like it can be quite simple. So I would start there. There's so much online right now of resources if you want to actually figure out how to make some of this food. I think one of the challenges people face most though is the cultural shift. That as you make some of these changes, you can feel isolated from people who aren't making them. And I think that's where I would go back to finding your people. If you can find either through your music or art or literary communities or your church or whatever it is, people that are interested in the same things, and you can support each other as you're doing this.
Excellent. Well, Will Potter, author of Little Red Barns, Hiding the Truth from Farm to Fable, as well as Green is the New Red, both from City Lights Books. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me about your work and your life and music and activism and the future of journalism. What a great chat. Thank you so much for being here.
It is wonderful talking to you, Greg. I appreciate your time.